If you're a Brian Laundrie apologist, I'm giving you a heads up now. Go ahead and click off this video. And for anyone in the comments saying, but the Laundries lost a son and a brother, I get that. But just know that in this video, I'll be showing them the exact same amount of respect that they have showed to the Petitos throughout this entire ordeal. Welcome to That's My Opinion, where we break down the biggest stories, uncover hidden truths, and explore why they matter. I'm Bacon Bears, and today we're diving into the new documentary on Gabby Petito. What was left out, what new insights we've gained, and why it all matters. Let's get started. This documentary opens with a 911 call, a male caller that reports seeing a man hitting a woman before they take off in a white van. He tells the dispatcher that he witnessed the male slapping the female, and soon after, police are able to track down the van. As officers follow the vehicle, bodycam footage captures erratic driving with the van swerving before eventually pulling over. And when the officers approach, we're introduced to Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. Brian is sitting behind the wheel while Gabby sits in the passenger seat, visibly upset. When asked why she was crying, she just tells the officer, "We were just fighting this morning. We're having personal issues." The officer asks Gabby to step out of the van, and she's clearly distressed. Her breathing is shaky, and she struggles to explain herself. But one thing stands out to me immediately. She won't stop apologizing. She apologizes to Brian. She apologizes to the officer. She even blames herself for distracting Brian, which led him to hit the curb. She says she's difficult to be around because of her OCD, calling herself mean and taking on all the blame. Gabby tells the officer that they had gotten into an argument and Brian wouldn't let her get back into the van until she had calmed down, which is interesting. That van belonged to Gabby. She then tells the officer, "I'm trying to start a blog. I was really busy this morning. I quit my job to travel across the country. I'm trying to get my business off the ground, and he doesn't believe that I can do any of that." And just like that, we get our first real look into their relationship. Right off the bat, I have thoughts. I have been here. And watching the first 10 minutes of this documentary, it really took me to a place that I would never like to revisit, and it felt very familiar. From here, the documentary would flash back to a moment of Gabby's mom pregnant and leaving for the hospital. A moment of excitement and anticipation. And as a mother myself, this part hit really hard. I remember that feeling with my kids. We didn't find out the sexes ahead of time, so each time it was a complete surprise. And you head to the hospital knowing you're about to meet this new little person that you're already in love with your whole being. And when they finally arrive, that love just multiplies by 10,000%. And this baby becomes your entire world, your reason for living. Everything changes in the most beautiful ways, and also sometimes in the most frustrating ways, because let's be real, parenting is straight ass. But even on the toughest days, it is still a very incredible experience. On March 19th, 1999, in Long Island, New York, Gabby Petito was born. Her parents, Nicole Schmidt and Joe Petito, were young. Nicole was just 20 when she had her. And the home footage of Gabby as a baby, yeah, she was full of life right from the start. And I don't know if you guys are into astrology, but being born on March 19th makes Gabby a Pisces. And Pisces are dreamers, wanderers, creatives. They love deeply. They go with the flow. They have this free-spirited nature about them. My husband is a Pisces, and they are amazing. Sometimes a little too sensitive, especially for me because I'm a Gemini, but they have these giant hearts and a unique way of seeing the world, which makes so much sense when you get a deeper look into who Gabby was. Joe and Nicole eventually separate when Gabby was about 6 months old, but both have said that Gabby was always their top priority, which as young parents shows an astounding maturity. They put their differences aside and they focus on raising her in a healthy, loving environment. As time goes on, Nicole and Joe remarry, and there are step parents that come in who love Gabby just as much. And they were able to build and create this beautiful blended family that genuinely cared and supported her. The documentary introduces us to a girl who is described as both Brian and Gabby's friend. They never actually give us her name, unless I missed it, which I found that whole thing really odd. But the way that she talks about Brian feels a little bit more intimate than just friendship, in my opinion. She shares a story about how they built this desk together and how Brian left a note inside and said, "You're either my best friend or the love of my life, and I can't tell the difference." And I'll give her the benefit of the doubt, but this part of the documentary immediately gave me odd vibes. She then explains that Brian was interested in her, but she wasn't interested in Brian, and over time they just drifted apart. But here's where I start questioning, why is this even relevant? The way that it's framed feels like Brian was into me, but I wasn't into him, so he just moved on. And honestly, it doesn't sit right with me. The story is about Gabby, and including this detail almost makes it feel like this could have been me, which I find unnecessary. It could have just been left at, we were friends. There's also not much that she adds to the documentary, and I almost feel like when she talks about Brian and Gabby, she does it through a romanticized lens, which feels weird knowing the topic of this documentary. I don't know if you watched the doc. If you did, let me know your thoughts, but that's just how all of that came off to me. So in March of 2019, Gabby and Brian start dating, and Gabby's parents are reflecting on meeting Brian for the first time. They describe him as quiet, socially awkward, but very polite, and they said that they liked him, just nothing to write home about. Eventually, Gabby made the decision to move from Long Island, New York, to Florida with Brian. Looking back at their relationship, knowing how it ends, this is where we can start to see patterns and red flags that can help us recognize similar dynamics in real life. And this is why Gabby's story is so important. Too often, people assume that controlling, abusive, and toxic relationships are something that only happen to older couples or married couples. But now in 2025, I think we're finally understanding that abuse doesn't have an age limit. It doesn't discriminate. It can happen to anyone at any age, at any stage of life. And Gabby's story really brought that reality to the forefront. One thing that stands out right away in her relationship with Brian is isolation. Isolation is one of the most powerful tactics in a controlling and abusive relationship. It doesn't happen overnight. It starts subtly. The abuser slowly cuts off friends and family, controls communication, and creates emotional dependence, making the victim feel like they have no one else. Over time, isolation breaks down self-esteem, making it even harder to leave. We're going to see this pattern repeat over and over again throughout Gabby's story. Brian frames it as a big, exciting step. Come move to Florida with me. It'll be so fun. But in reality, it's almost as he's pulling her away from her entire support system so that he could become her only source of stability. By December of 2019, Gabby and Brian had been dating for 9 months, and now they were in Florida. They had packed up all of Gabby's belongings and made the drive together. The reason Florida was the destination? Because that's where Brian's family lived. So Brian and Gabby move in with Brian's parents, and at first, everything seems fine until it's not. Roberta Laundrie, Brian's mom, starts showing these weird jealousy issues, getting irritated by how much time Brian and Gabby are spending together. But at the same time, Brian is Gabby's only lifeline in Florida. So who else is she supposed to spend time with? And honestly, if they're in their 20s talking about spending their lives together and living under the same roof, of course they're going to spend a lot of time together. It's normal. It's a honeymoon phase. It's what new little couples do. But this is where Roberta starts showing her true colors, and Gabby begins confiding in her own mom about how things are actually going. In one text exchange, Gabby tells Brian that Roberta seems upset and she's too afraid to leave the room, which I'm sure we've all been there before, right? You're at your friend's house or a significant other's house and their parents are upset and you're like, I'm not going out there. It's a very uncomfortable thing to deal with when it's not your own parents. But Brian just brushes it off, replying, like, just say goodbye. It'll blow over. No problem. Brian should have stepped in. At this point, his mom is acting in a way that is making Gabby uncomfortable. And instead of acknowledging that, he just shrugs it off. A real conversation needed to happen. Something like, hey, mom, you're saying and doing things that are making Gabby really uncomfortable. Can we talk about this? Or at the very least, they could all have sat down and cleared the air. But instead, Brian minimizes it. And of course, it's easy for him to brush it off because it's his mom. But she is living in their home, completely isolated from her own family. and now feeling uncomfortable in the one place that's supposed to feel safe. Gabby's mom, Nicole, tells a story about how she got a letter in the mail stating that Gabby's mailing address had been changed back to Long Island, New York. Confused, Nicole asked Gabby about it, thinking maybe she's planning on coming home. But Gabby had said, nope, I didn't change my address. So naturally, Nicole's like, well, who did? And Gabby's response? I think Roberta, Brian's mom, did. And at this point, Nicole texted Gabby saying she definitely hates you. And honestly, if that were me and I had such an issue with someone living in my home, I would just, ask them to leave. I never understand passive aggressive behavior. I am aggressive. If there's a problem, address it like an adult and deal with it. And the fact that Roberta, a grown woman, allegedly went behind Gabby's back to change her mailing address instead of just having a conversation with her is odd behavior. But we continue to see nothing but odd behavior from all of the Laundries. So don't worry, this is not just exclusive to Roberta. Then we meet a friend named Rose Davis. And this is Gabby's friend, who I really like. I would like to hang out with her myself. She seems really great. But they actually met on Bumble, which, side note, I always thought Bumble was just for dating, but apparently you can make friends on there too, which I think is really cool at this day and age. But anyways, Rose and Gabby instantly hit it off. They became really close. They spend a lot of time together. They make TikToks and just do fun, carefree, best friend stuff. But then Rose tells us this unsettling story about the first time that she met Brian, and he wanted to meet her. So they all go to the beach. But instead of hanging out with them, Brian sat back and watched them the entire time. Rose describes it as feeling like a parent supervising a play date, which is very odd. And honestly, huge red flag behavior. Rose goes on to describe what Brian and Gabby's relationship really looked like. And she breaks it down into two parts of both when they're together and then when they're apart. And when they're together, things seemed loving and normal and fine. But when apart, Brian's manipulative side really started to show. One example that she gave was they were supposed to go out line dancing, but Gabby was running late. Well, it turns out that Brian had stolen her ID from her purse. And when confronted, he admitted to it, and he took it because he didn't want her to go. And as we've already seen, this is controlling behavior, manipulation, and isolation. It's about deciding where she can and cannot go, and more importantly, who she can and cannot be around. And again, in Gabby's text message to Rose, she immediately apologizes. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm fighting with Brian. And I just feel like Gabby was constantly carrying the emotional weight of things that were never hers to carry. She was taking on responsibility for his behavior instead of being allowed to just feel upset about it, which she should. You took my ID so that I couldn't go out with my friends, which is ridiculous behavior. She should not feel bad about that, but he's gotten her to a place that she does. Rose also gives great insight into another manipulation tactic. Brian used gift giving. In a controlling relationship, gifts aren't always about love or kindness. They can be a form of control. An abuser may give expensive or sentimental gifts to create a sense of debt or obligation, making the victim feel guilty for setting boundaries, maybe guilty for leaving, or even getting upset. Gifts can also be used to smooth over abusive behavior, creating a toxic cycle where the victim feels pressured to be grateful despite the mistreatment. In some cases, gifts become another tool of control, with the abuser expecting something in return. These gifts have strings attached, whether it's loyalty, compliance, or emotional dependence. Eventually, Brian and Gabby would go camping, and that's where he proposes to her. And here's what's strange. Gabby doesn't tell anyone. She doesn't call her mom. She doesn't tell her dad. Brian never even asked her dad for permission. And if you're truly excited about getting engaged, wouldn't that be something you'd want to share? I mean, sure, maybe you hold off on posting it on social media, but your mom, your best friend, it feels off. And what makes it even weirder is that Brian tells his female friend, the one that they don't give us her name, but Gabby tells nobody. Instead, her mom finds out through Facebook because Roberta Laundrie Brian's mom had posted about it first. Not long after the engagement, they decide to get a van. Well, Gabby buys the van. She finances it herself and converts it into a camper. Very important. Just make sure we put a pin in that. The plan is to travel across the country together and just adventure, explore, and enjoy being in your early 20s, before you have to settle down. Just go, be wild and free. And the more that I watch this, the more I'm reminded of past relationships I've been in before my husband. And I don't know if I would have listened at the time, but I wish I had someone who recognized this behavior for me. Because back then, I could not see it for myself. And as we've spoken about before, you don't realize how bad it is until you're way too far in it. But Gabby had a dream and she was determined to chase it. She worked long hours at Taco Bell, spent time with Rose, and nothing was going to stand in her way. But as Rose describes it, Brian started getting possessive because now it wasn't about him anymore. And then the documentary starts to show texts from Brian. And if you've ever dated someone like this message, it was so familiar. But it says, "I'll be happy when I see you, but I'm so pissed right now. I fucking hate that you ever worked at Taco Bell with all those lowlifes." But here's the thing. It's never about Taco Bell or whatever that text that's being sent to you is actually about, right? It wouldn't have mattered if she worked at a 5-star restaurant or an office job. The issue wasn't where she worked. It was the fact that she was working at all. It was the fact that she had a dream, a goal. And for Brian, the real problem was that he wasn't her number one priority. And this is something that happens all the time in abusive relationships. Nothing you do is ever good enough. You'll never work hard enough. You'll never make enough money. And your dreams will always be dismissed as stupid because the abuser wants full control. It turns into, "I know what's best for you." And suddenly you find yourself constantly trying to prove yourself, trying to make them happy, to make them proud, because deep down, you should want your partner to be proud of you. That's normal. But what's not normal is having to beg for it. And this is how the control sneaks in. It's subtle at first. It's those lowlifes at Taco Bell. It's, "You're better than this." It's framed as if he's looking out for her. But really, it's about breaking her down piece by piece until she quits, which is his ultimate goal. Because once she stops working, she's even more dependent on him, not only emotional, but financially. And then in another text exchange, Gabby apologizes to Brian, which, for what? For having a job? For wanting a life outside of him? And his response, "I don't know why you had to turn into one of them." Fucking disgusting. Turn into what, Brian? A person with a job? A person trying to better herself? A person trying to earn her own money, build her own future, pave her own way? Turn into what exactly? To look down on anyone who has a job? Yuck. And then Brian does what abusers do when they're not getting through to you fast enough. They spiderweb out to the people who love you. Your mom, your sister, your dad, your friends, anyone in your support system. And they say, "Come get this girl. She's not listening to me and I need your help because she's in trouble." And suddenly the abuser is building trust with your support system, making it seem like they're the victim while subtly isolating you even further. I've been here more than once. But I've had exes pull this exact same move. I broke up with someone, stopped taking their calls, and the next thing I knew, they were reaching out to my friends, my family, my coworkers, trying to get to me through one of them. One of my exes even wrote a 12-page dissertation on why I should just talk to them because apparently I was making a huge mistake. And thankfully, I had friends at the time who were like, "Don't ever fucking contact me again." But we see it happen here. Brian texts Gabby, "Please, please, please forgive me. I'm calling your mom. I'm fucked in every aspect of my life now. I just wanted this week to go smoothly. I'm crying so hard in the dumb fucking bathroom typing this. So now we've gone from you're fucking disgusting, to which didn't work, to I'm crying. I'm so sad. I need your help. You can save me. It's a full-blown spiral to get her attention back. And I'm sorry if I'm coming off as more aggressive in this episode. I usually have a more unbiased take, but I didn't expect this documentary to bring up so many emotions. I think it's because not only was I 20 once, going through these same exact things, but now I think about my daughter. Even my son. My son is not exempt from this behavior. And one day, they'll be 20. And I can only hope that I instill in them enough trust in us as parents that when they can't see the red flags, maybe we can. But more importantly, I want them to be able to trust themselves. I want them to be confident in their decisions and be able to put their foot down and to recognize when some idiot pulls some manipulative bullshit like this. And we see Gabby's response to Brian's text. I don't want you to be sad. I love you so much. I'm sorry. Because sometimes for the abused, it's just easier to apologize for the abuser's behavior and move on. Rose brings up emotional dependence, which is a huge piece of the puzzle in these kinds of relationships. Emotional dependence happens when someone relies entirely on another person for validation, happiness, and even self-worth. In controlling relationships, the abuser creates this dependence by isolating their partners, undermining their confidence, and using a cycle of affection and mistreatment to keep them trapped. Over time, the victim feels incapable of making decisions or leaving because they believe they need the abuser to survive, or vice versa. And watching all of these videos of Gabby is truly heartbreaking. She just seems like this bubbly, adventurous, ready to go kind of person, someone who was excited to see the world, experience life, and just have fun. And then on the other side, you have Brian Laundrie, who is more reserved, which is fine. But there's something else there. A lot of people joke about the golden retriever energy versus the black cat energy in relationships, but Brian had a darker, more pessimistic side. And you can see this in his artwork, in his writing, in his social media presence. There was just something so different about the two of them. And again, I can tell you from personal experience, there are people out there who are just drawn to your light. That's what gets them there in the first place. They love that you walk into a room, you light it up, you're fun, you're friendly, you're happy, you party. But once they have you, their only goal is to extinguish that light. They cannot stand that you still have it. Because at the same time, they don't want anybody else to be drawn to you for the same reasons that they were. And once they put out your fire, your spark, your light, whatever you want to call it, which is a part of who you are, that's what builds your self-esteem and your confidence. And once your self-esteem is gone, you're stuck. Because if you don't believe in yourself anymore, you're not going anywhere. Gabby and Brian set out in their van life trip on July 2nd of 2021. Before she left, Gabby saw her mom, Nicole, and her mom tells this story about their last hug. She had given Gabby some money, hugged her tight, and noticed that Gabby started crying. And when she asked, "Why are you crying?" Gabby simply said, "I don't know." But she hugged her even tighter. And Nicole looked at Brian and said, "You take care of Gabby." And Brian said, "I will." And as a mother, I can't even imagine that moment. Not just the pain, but the guilt that must come with it. Then the documentary shows Gabby and Brian trying to film their vlog. And there's a huge contrast. When Gabby is on camera with Rose, she's laughing, she's having fun, she's carefree. But when Gabby is on camera with Brian, she looks nervous, uncomfortable, and like she's constantly second guessing herself. And watching their behind the scenes footage, it just felt like they didn't even really enjoy each other. It was really uncomfortable to watch. And they show a letter from Gabby where she writes, quote, "I feel bad I'm always on my phone. I should give Brian more attention. He loves me so much. I don't deserve it." And here's the thing. A lot of people enter relationships already feeling this way. But Brian had two choices. You could build her up, make her feel like she did deserve his love, or keep her right where she was so she continued to feel undeserving of him. And we already know which path he chose. They flash to a photo of Gabby. Her face is streaked with tears, what looks like blood on her cheek, and visible scratch marks. This photo was retrieved from her phone, and while we don't know if she ever sent it to anyone, I assume she saved it for a reason. Maybe she was going to do something with it. Maybe she was documenting what was happening to her. But at this point, she's in Brian's dream scenario. They're in the middle of nowhere, on the road, isolated. He's the only person she has. She is trying to live this dream, but at the same time, she's trying to tend to Brian. And in this tiny van, there's nowhere to escape. And this is where we get back to the 911 call that we started in the beginning. A witness reports seeing a van with Florida plates and a man slapping a woman. When police pull them over, Brian admits that they had an altercation. But of course, he paints Gabby as the aggressor. He says she was getting out of control. She had her cell phone in her hand, so I had to push her away. And watching the body cam footage, they both have visible injuries. Gabby has marks on her face and arms, and Brian had scratches on his face as well. When the officer asks Gabby, "Did he hit you?" she hesitates before saying, "Well, I guess I hit him first." But she also says that Brian grabbed her face and she was just trying to get him off of her. And I know everyone handles high stress situations differently, but watching Gabby sitting in the back of that police car, she looks completely broken. She can barely speak. She can't tell her story. She can't even catch her breath. And then you look at Brian in the body cam footage, and he's the exact opposite. He's calm, collected, casually explaining, "Yeah, we were just fighting. I was just trying to de-escalate. We just needed to breathe," acting like this was all just some small misunderstanding. And at one point, he even seems to be joking, saying, a lot of hands, a lot of nails, a lot of rings. The difference between how they're handling this moment is stark. Meanwhile, Gabby is sobbing, begging the officers to let her get her phone so that she can call her mother. And as a mother, I just wanted to reach into that screen and hold her. Gabby's mom talks about how she sees this footage for the first time, and she saw it with the rest of the world. And that's when she realized that this was way worse than she ever thought. She saw her daughter terrified, breaking down, completely distressed. And as a mother, all you want to do is scoop up your baby and take away their pain. It doesn't matter how old they are. And then they flash to Brian, laughing and joking with the officers. And I swear, if I were Nicole, I would have wanted, I'm not even Nicole, and I want to fly through that TV because this is not a funny haha kiki kind of moment. At this point, social media was confused. People were watching this footage and wondering, how did this end with Gabby gone and Brian walking free? Nobody was arrested, but Gabby was made to be out to be the aggressor, and they took Brian to a hotel. And then the thought that runs through my head, what did Brian Laundrie's parents think when they saw this footage? Honestly, I feel like I already know the answer. Because Brian was great at talking his way out of things, and because his parents immediately got him a lawyer to protect him, I'm sure they also wanted to believe that Gabby was the aggressor. So in my opinion, seeing that footage probably didn't even faze them at all. I have to tell you, as a mother, if I saw blood on a female's face from the hands of my son, girl, I'll tell you, my son would be better off in police custody because we're going to have a problem. As a mother, I would be all the emotions, mortified, embarrassed. Brian was bigger than her. He could have just walked into any one of the stores. If she truly was the aggressor, right? Brian, having a physical advantage, had every opportunity to go into a store or leave. If he was truly trying to de-escalate the situation, why are there handprints on her face? At one point, officers tell Gabby that they're going to be separated for the night, and she begs them not to. She says they're a team and that she doesn't want to be apart from him. And this moment brings up so many questions. Why? Is it because Gabby is emotionally dependent on him and feels like she can't regulate her emotions or feel safe without him because he's made it that way? Is it because she fears what will happen after police leave? if she doesn't go back to Brian? Or is it because Brian has successfully isolated her from everything and everyone, and now in this traumatic moment, she's looking for comfort, but the only person left to comfort her is the person who's caused this drama in the first place? And this is where you can see the cycle of behavior. The officers talk to Gabby, and she downplays the situation, saying that it was just a silly argument. And one of the officers responds, yeah, well, silly arguments don't lead to putting hands on each other. And he has marks. So does she. But also, just because someone doesn't have marks on them doesn't mean that they weren't assaulted. Remember, she said that he put his hands on her face. Instead of handling this as a domestic violence situation, the officers chalk it up to Gabby's anxiety, or what it feels like to me. There's a lot of focus put on Gabby's anxiety. So they separate them. They decide Gabby's going to go in the van and stay by herself, and Brian's going to go to a hotel. Gabby's mom, Nicole, even brings up a really good point. They're in the middle of nowhere, in a place they don't even know. But Gabby's the one left alone in the van while Brian is sent to a hotel. But in the end, it doesn't matter because they would ignore the officer's advice and they would meet up again that night anyways. From everything we know now, it's clear officers failed to follow proper domestic violence protocols, and that failure could have saved Gabby's life. One major issue was the misidentification of the primary aggressor. Gabby was crying, apologizing excessively, and visibly fearful, while Brian remained calm and collected, a classic manipulation tactic used by abusers. Instead of focusing only on visible injuries, officers should have considered the power dynamics. And I don't know, witness statements. The male was slapping the female. That's why 911 got called in the first place. That alone should have changed the entire course of this investigation. Under Utah law, police are required to arrest or cite an individual if domestic violence has occurred. Neither Gabby nor Brian were arrested. And Brian, who admitted to grabbing Gabby's face, was allowed to leave with no consequences. Officers also neglected to provide Gabby with domestic violence resources or safety planning, which could have helped her seek assistance later or in private. Another critical failure, no follow-up welfare check. With so many red flags in this encounter, authorities should have checked in on Gabby later to ensure that she was safe. Had these proper protocols been followed, Gabby may have received the support and protection that she needed. Because of this case, there have been important discussions about law enforcement training, highlighting the urgent need for better education on emotional abuse, coercive control, and recognizing the real signs of a victim in distress. A lot of people were outraged over how this was handled, including Gabby's family, including myself. In November of 2022, Gabby Petito's parents filed a $50 million wrongful death lawsuit against the Moab Police Department, arguing that officers failed to properly handle the August 12, 2021 domestic violence stop. They claimed law enforcement negligence contributed to her death by misidentifying her as the primary aggressor and failing to enforce Utah's domestic violence laws. However, in November of 2024, a Utah judge dismissed the lawsuit, citing the Governmental Immunity Act, which protects public entities from certain legal claims. While the court ruled in favor of Moab police, the judge acknowledged that the officers' actions may have played a role in Gabby's death. Gabby's mom, Nicole Schmidt, recalls how after the Moab incident, she spoke to Gabby. Gabby told her that Brian was flying home to empty a storage unit, and in the meantime, she would stay at a hotel and work on her YouTube channel. Then we hear from a man named Jackson, Gabby's ex-boyfriend, who reveals that this van life dream, traveling the country, starting a YouTube channel, this was something Gabby had dreamed about for a long time before Brian ever came into the picture. She had originally talked about doing this with Jackson. Gabby had also confided in Jackson that she was ready to end things with Brian. On August 27th of 2021, Gabby reached out to Jackson and she sent him a Snapchat and she tried calling him, but he was at work and he couldn't answer. And the documentary would then show footage of Gabby and Brian at a Whole Foods in Jackson, Wyoming. In the parking lot, Brian aggressively shuts the van door and walks inside. They do some shopping, and then they leave. And the documentary would tell us that this is the last known footage of Gabby Petito. In a relationship this controlling, it's not far-fetched to assume that the abuser would want to check their partner's phone. track their messages, or monitor their activity. And honestly, I wonder if at this point, Brian already knew, or at least had suspicion, that she was texting Jackson, or at least someone he thought she shouldn't have been texting. Because in relationships like this, it doesn't have to be about what's actually happening. It's also about what the abuser believes is happening. I've personally been in situations where I wasn't texting anyone I, quote, shouldn't have been texting, but because suspicion was raised for one reason or another, it turns into this blowout argument. And sometimes abusers don't even need a reason. They'll just start fights to break you down, just to remind you who's in control. I think Gabby was juggling two things here, right? Keeping Brian happy and knowing that she wanted to leave. She's holding on to her dream, believing that if she could just get through this, she could figure the rest out later. And I'm sure there was a thought process, right? Of let me just get through this next step and then I'll deal with it, rather than cutting it off in the middle of everything. And I have to ask, was Moab the first time? When Brian put his hands on Gabby, was this the first time? Because if Brian had done this before, then Gabby already knew what he was capable of. But if this was the first time, then to Gabby, he was now even more unpredictable. And when someone becomes unpredictable, your brain switches into self-preservation mode. Because if they're capable of that, then what else are they capable of? Gabby's mom, Nicole, texts to check in on her, and Gabby responds that Brian is going camping and she's keeping the van by herself. You can sense the tension in the messages. But one thing that stands out is Gabby tells her mom, Brian says I can have the van if I pay him. And that's interesting because pay him for what? Because that van belonged to Gabby. Gabby told him she could make more money as a solo female van lifer. And honestly, if you know anyone like Brian Laundrie telling them that you don't need them or that anybody else might be interested in you, huge trigger. Because guys like Brian don't like when you push back. They don't like to have their ego busted on. They don't like emotional independence, or independence at all for that matter. The 27th is the last known time that anyone hears from Gabby. And on August 28th, the documentary shows footage of Brian vlogging. And I don't know if Netflix added this for emotional impact, but up until this point, we haven't seen Brian take the camera once. And suddenly he's documenting everything. And based on what is assumed, Gabby was likely killed on the 27th. So if that's true, this man picked up a camera and started vlogging the very next day. Wow. Everything is content, I guess. But he went on a hike, took a bunch of photos, and just enjoyed his time. On August 30th, Gabby's mom, Nicole Schmidt, gets a text message from Gabby's phone, and it says, "Can you help Stan? I just keep getting his voicemails and missed calls." And immediately, Nicole thinks this is strange because Stan is Gabby's grandfather, but she never calls him Stan. She always calls him Grandpa. And at first, Nicole assumes Brian must have sent the text because maybe Gabby is driving and he just grabbed her phone to text. She doesn't think too much of it. But then she can't get a hold of Gabby at all. Nicole keeps texting. Nothing. No social media updates, phone calls, nothing. And that was it. By September 9th, Nicole reaches out to Gabby's dad, Joe Petito, and says, "Hey, have you heard from Gabby? I can't get a hold of her." And Joe responds, "No, I haven't heard from her either." And now they're extremely worried. Like any mother would, Nicole tries calling Brian, but Brian doesn't answer. So then she reaches out to Roberta, Brian's mom, and the text goes through. But here's where it gets weird. On iPhones, when a message goes through, it's blue. So Nicole sends another follow-up message, and this time it's green, which would insinuate that she was now blocked. Now, Joe Petito tries reaching out to Brian's parents. Nothing. They even send a final message. "We're calling the police." And still no response. Gabby lived with the Laundries. She was going to be their daughter-in-law. And now her parents are reaching out panicked, telling them that they're calling the police, and there's just nothing. Gabby's mom, Nicole Schmidt, is in full panic mode. She starts calling places Gabby had been to, trying to report her missing, but they tell her that she has to file a report with the local police. Now remember, Nicole Schmidt and Joe Petito live in Long Island, New York, but they call the Northport Police in Florida because that's where Brian Laundrie's parents live, and that's where Gabby was living at the time. So the police go to the Laundrie's house, and Brian's parents actually come outside. At this moment, my heart is racing. Brian and Roberta walk out the front door, and immediately Brian's dad says, "We're not talking to you." The police say, okay, well, we have a detective on the phone. You don't want to talk to them now? And the Laundries say no. Then the officer asks, when was the last time that you saw Brian and Gabrielle? And Brian's dad says, well, Brian's here. And that's when the police tell them why they're there. They explain that Gabby's parents are trying to reach Brian and he's not answering and they're worried. And Brian's dad acts confused, saying they keep calling and we don't know why. We have an attorney though, but you do know why they're calling. They told you exactly why they're calling. They can't get a hold of Gabby. And now Brian's dad is flat out lying to the police. And we have the text messages to prove it. It's been 12 days since Gabby's mom last spoke to her. 12 days. And somehow Brian manages to get from Grand Teton, Wyoming back to Florida, hire an attorney, and have a full legal strategy in place. Before really diving into this case, I didn't realize how fast the Laundries were moving, which tells me when Joe Petito called and said we're calling the police, they already had a lawyer. I went into this documentary and I wanted to understand the parents of Brian Laundrie. I have a son. I have a daughter. And I cannot imagine losing a child. But I also can't imagine being the parent of the reason of why somebody else lost their child. And I thought about what I would do as a mother in this situation. But I have to tell you, after sitting and watching this documentary, I am repulsed by this family right now. Repulsed. And so the police officer asks about the van, which is in the driveway. And the officer says, is this her vehicle? And Brian's dad said, it's both of theirs. No, it's not. No, it is not. It's hers. She owns it, period. And when I looked it up, the 2012 Ford Transit Connect was fully owned and registered in Gabby Petito's name. She financed it herself. All of their behavior really explains why your son is the way that he is. At first, I was really confused as to why the police didn't just ask Brian to come out and speak with them. But after a quick Google search, I found my answer. They didn't ask Brian to come out because his family immediately refused to cooperate and directed officers to their attorney. And since Brian hadn't been charged with a crime yet, police can't legally force him to talk. And by exercising his right to remain silent, Brian completely avoided questioning. At this time, Gabby was still considered a missing person and not a homicide victim. So law enforcement had limited authority to intervene. And while a lot of people, myself included, think the police should have monitored Brian more closely, the reality is they legally lacked probable cause to detain or interrogate him without evidence of a crime. The documentary shows a conversation between the police and detectives from Long Island, and you can tell immediately that everyone is suspicious. The Laundries won't talk. They lied about the van. Brian's sister told detectives that he was home after he left Gabby at a hotel, and she said that he flew home. But if he flew home, then why is the van in the driveway? And both the police and detectives are like, no. Something is not adding up. So the sergeant comes in. He goes back to the Laundrie house to speak with Roberta and Mr. Laundrie. I don't care to know his name. They didn't say his name. I don't care to know it or use it. They both answer the door, and the sergeant asks, is there any way I could talk to your son? And Brian's dad's like, no. He's not talking to anybody. Why? Well, we know why. But in that moment, if you're an officer just trying to piece things together, why? It honestly feels like the Laundries went into this thinking, let's make ourselves look as suspicious as possible. And even the sergeant calls them out. And he's like, as the parents, don't you find it odd the way that you're behaving? And Brian's dad's like, yeah, I don't know, call our attorney. And the officer isn't having it. He's like, an attorney is not going to answer my call at 11 o'clock at night. And at this point, Roberta is trying to usher Mr. Laundrie back into the house. And the sergeant turns the conversation to the van. The officer says, this van belongs to Gabby. And the dad goes, well, we don't know that. And the officer says, no, I'm telling you that. Here in Florida, it's registered to Gabby and only Gabby. So now I'm going to get a tow truck and I'm going to take it. At this point, the detectives go straight to Nicole Schmidt's house, Gabby's mom, and they tell her Brian is home with the van and he has a lawyer. And that's when Gabby's parents go into overdrive. They take it to social media. They start making posters. They go to the press. They make sure Gabby's face is everywhere. And Joe Petito heads to Florida for a press conference. Not only does he talk about Gabby and plead for help finding her, but he also throws the Laundrie name into the mix, putting a ton of pressure on them. And honestly, just fantastic. Because at this point, we're watching it all unfold in real time. It's everywhere. It's on social media. It's on the news. It's on YouTube. Gabby's face is everywhere. But along with Gabby's face, Brian's face is everywhere too. On September 13th, Jim, Gabby's stepdad, goes to Wyoming, the last place that she was seen. By this point, Teton police had called in the FBI so they could work hand in hand to find Gabby. They exhausted every single resource: horses, drones, helicopters, search teams, on foot, on four-wheelers, anything and everything that they could to help spread out the search and bring her home. Meanwhile, surveillance was set up on the Laundrie house. The media was there, bystanders are there, and I have to say, I will never, ever, 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 ever condone inserting yourself into an active case or harassing people when you have nothing to do with a situation, or harassing people in general. The internet has created this weird dynamic where people feel so connected to a case that they try to physically insert themselves into it. And normally I would tell you never to do this, but in this situation, I'm not mad about it. I wasn't mad about it because this family needed to feel the pressure. You have Brian Laundrie's dad casually mowing his lawn just in the morning, while on the other side of the country, Gabby's family is frantically searching for their missing daughter, your son's fiance. How the Laundries could even show their faces outside of their home at this point, fully flabbergasted. Gas are flabbered. People are protesting right on their front lawn, and they were demanding to know where Gabby was. There's a scene in the documentary where someone sticks a picture of Gabby in Brian's dad's truck, and he just rips it out like it's nothing. Imagine being that cold and that heartless. Could never. Couldn't be me. Can't relate. And the way they walk around their house, they're storming around their house all pissed off, acting like they're the victims. But at this point, he stole her van and came home. And look, I get it. From a parent's perspective, if your child is in serious legal trouble, of course you are going to protect them. Whether the Laundries knew what Brian did or not, he clearly needed a lawyer, and they were going to have his back. But to completely disregard Gabby and her entire family, to go on living life like she never even existed. And then when Brian gets home, they all go on a camping trip together to Fort DeSoto with his sister Cassie. Which timeline are you on? Because we're all on this one. Cassie eventually comes out and talks to either protesters or the press. And I remember watching this in real time, and I felt so bad for her because at the time I thought, I don't know what she knows, right? I have siblings. I'm not in their daily lives every second of every day. So at the time I understood her position. However, take your fingers away from the keyboard, because there are some things that she has said recently that make me feel not so bad for her anymore, which we'll get into later. Put a pin in it. And this is where I really don't condone people showing up at someone's house when they don't have all the information, because in reality, Cassie actually cooperated with police, right? She told them what Brian told her. She had no other information. Her brother's actions are not her actions. And during the press statement, Cassie claims that Brian never mentioned anything about Gabby during their camping trip that they had. She says that she had her kids with her and they only stayed for 8 hours, and it was just a casual family get-together. They talked about nothing important. But she tells the press or these protesters or whoever in her front lawn that she's also losing everything: her brother, her parents, her sister-in-law, her kid's future aunt. And when someone asks, why are you losing your parents? She responds, because they won't talk to me. So at this point, it seems like she's completely isolated from her family, or at least that's what she's saying. And I got at this point, when I watched it in real time, why she was frustrated, right? If my brother did some stupid ass shit and now I have people standing in my front lawn screaming at me, and I have my children in the house and I truly didn't know anything, I would be upset too. I'd be like, get off my lawn. However, as of late, Cassie has been trying to spin a new narrative that Brian was the victim of domestic violence and abuse. And even if that were true, even if he was in a toxic or abusive relationship, that still gave him zero right to take Gabby's life. I also find it interesting that Cassie's Instagram is still public. Why? Just private your account. You're not a content creator. So if you're really trying to avoid backlash, wouldn't you just lock it down? I feel like she wants people to see her messages. Her most recent post from a week ago literally says, if you're new here and you're just starting to attack me today, I've been non-contact with my parents for almost 2 years. Have fun. Girl, just private your account. Just private it. But you don't want to, which is interesting to me. And then the first comment under her post, quote, girl, a quick glance at your account shows that you have never, not once, advocated for Gabby. Posting links to articles about men being victims of domestic violence and not so subtle jabs at her family in your captions over the years. Your brother and strangled a waif of a woman to death, and you're excusing it because what? She scratched him after he cut her eye and tried to lock her out of her vehicle, after he emotionally manipulated her and isolated her from her friends and family in classic textbook abusive behavior. If you didn't want the heat, stop lighting the fires. You and your folks deserve all the backlash and karma you're getting for the complete lack of grace you showed that poor girl's family during one of the worst things a parent could go through. And honestly, I'll wait for anyone to tell me where that comment is wrong, because the answer is nowhere. Cassie also posted, quote, I told law enforcement all about the DV that happened to my brother over the years. I told media, I told lawyers. The narrative stays the same. At this point, it's ridiculous. This family is so bizarre. But also, it explains so much. So much. And this is what's ridiculous. Cassie also put up a post about Suicide Awareness and Prevention Month, talking about the warning signs, which is not why Brian took his own life. This was not an ongoing mental health struggle that tragically ended in suicide. Brian took someone's life, and then to avoid consequences, he took his own. These two things are not the same. And I could go through more of her Instagram, but for my own mental well-being, I had to get off her page, because every time I try to give an ounce of benefit of the doubt to this family, I just can't. And then in another twist, law enforcement goes to conduct a welfare check on the Laundrie residence. And that's when his parents report Brian missing, saying they haven't seen him in days. And somehow, with all the surveillance, all the media, all the protesters outside the house, Brian was still able to leave. I have no idea how that happened. And they go into the house and they find a note written by Roberta Laundrie to Brian that literally says, burn after reading. I've tried to put myself in the shoes of Brian Laundrie's parents. What do you do when your son comes home and you start putting all the pieces together? Because I do believe that a parent's first instinct is to protect their child. But how far does that go? And I don't know. I'm not in that position. And let me be very clear. I am not making excuses for the Laundries, because I would never. But I also know what it feels like to love your child so much that you would take a bullet for them without thinking twice. However, as I've thought more and more about this, I would take a bullet for my kids. Absolutely. I would do anything for my children, but I would not go to prison for them. And I think that's the difference. But I don't know. I don't ever want to know, because that has to be the most messed up place that a parent could ever be. Because from the outside, we can say he's a monster, he's a coward, he's garbage, and we can separate from it. But as a mother, can you? At the very least, even if she didn't want to communicate with Gabby's family, she should have communicated with police. A mother was looking for her daughter, your future daughter-in-law. A family was desperate for answers, and they were owed that information. I read a comment on a thread that was so beautifully articulated, and it just said, you can love someone unconditionally and still hold them accountable. And it's true. And then we get to Roberta's letter, and it reads, I just want you to remember I will always love you, and I know you will always love me. You are my boy. Nothing can make me stop loving you. Nothing will or could ever divide us. No matter what we do, where we go, or what we say, we will always love each other. If you're in jail, I will bake a cake with a file in it. If you need to dispose of a body, I will show up with a shovel and garbage bags. If you fly to the moon, I will be watching the skies for your re-entry. If you say you hate my guts, I'll get new guts. Remember that love is a verb, not a noun. It's not a thing. It's not words. It's actions. Watch people's actions to know if they love you, not their words. Therefore, I am certain that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor the ruling spirits, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers from above, nor powers from below. Nothing in the entire created world can separate our love. Neither hostile powers, nor messengers of heaven, nor monarchs of earth. Nothing has the power to separate us. Not hatred, not hunger, not homelessness, not threats, not even sin. Not the thinkable or unthinkable can get between us. Not time, not miles and miles and miles. Romans 8:38. And as I'm reading the script right now, the immediate thought was, what did Cassie think when Brian got a letter like this from his mom? Now, Roberta has said that this letter in no way pertains to Gabby. I'll let me know what you think about that in the comment box down below. The police officially asked the public for help, and this is where social media truly shines. People start digging through their own photos and vlogs, searching for any trace of Gabby or Brian, and the internet came together in a way that was incredible, and it worked. Another van life couple reviewing their vlog footage actually caught Gabby's van parked in the exact area police needed to investigate. In today's world of vlogging, social media, and personal devices, you're still being recorded. Even in the most remote locations, something, somewhere, is capturing it. It's now been 20 days since Gabby last made contact with anyone, and then they find her. Gabby Petito is discovered at Spread Creek Dispersed Camping Area in Wyoming. She was wrapped in a sweater, lying in what was described as an unnatural position, with her boots placed next to her. Nearby, it looked like someone had tried to start a fire. An FBI agent in the documentary says that this whole scene looked staged. The coroner ruled Gabby's death as a homicide by strangulation with signs of blunt force trauma. Gabby's stepdad, Jim, was the one who had to identify her through photos. And then he was the one who had to make the call. He called Nicole, her mom, Joe, her dad, and Tara, her stepmom. And then Nicole Schmidt had the impossible task of telling her other children that their sister was gone. With Gabby officially found, this is no longer just a missing person case. And this means law enforcement can now do more when it comes to Brian Laundrie. In every episode, we go through a timeline, and this is the one that the documentary gave us. At 1 p.m., Gabby and Brian are at Mary Piglet's Mexican restaurant having an argument. Brian is upset. Gabby is crying. 1:45 p.m., Gabby tries to call Jackson, but he's at work. 2:13 p.m., Gabby is seen at Whole Foods. This is the last known footage of her alive. 6 p.m., they arrive at Spread Creek. 6 to 6:30 p.m., the van is spotted on the side of the road. By 7:15 p.m., Gabby sends her last text to Nicole, her mother, talking about how she could be a solo female van lifer. By 8:32 p.m., files are being moved on Gabby's computer. And by August 28th, there is no more movement from Gabby's devices. But now, Brian is out hiking, taking scenic photos. On August 28th at 1:20 p.m., Brian has a 55-minute phone call with his mother. After cross-checking phone records, investigators found that after this call, Brian's father immediately contacted an attorney. And here's my issue with the idea that this was a crime of passion. He quickly started setting up an alibi. He immediately started staging a crime scene. He continued sending text messages. I don't know, it just all feels very calculated. And then Brian hikes all the way to Coulter Bay. Here's what we do know about his movements that night. 5:55 p.m., Brian is picked up hitchhiking by a woman named Miranda Baker and her boyfriend. 6:30 p.m., he arrives at Jackson Lake Dam. Around the same time, he's picked up by another woman who drives him the rest of the way to the Spread Creek entrance. She offers to drive him in and all the way back to his van, but he refuses. Instead, he gets out of the car and he walks. And all while this is happening, he's still texting Gabby's phone, but he's texting as if he's in Coulter Bay, even though her texts aren't being sent until he gets back to Spread Creek. August 30th, Brian leaves Wyoming and heads back to Florida. Along the way, he sends a text to Gabby's mom, Nicole Schmidt, pretending to be Gabby, about her grandfather contacting her. And while driving home, he's stopping at gas stations, using Gabby's debit card, using her van, because of course I can assume that in his mind, if it's hers, it's his. But this next part is particularly gross. Brian uses Zelle, which if you don't know what that is, it's like Venmo or instant money transfers between phones. And he transfers $700 from Gabby's account to himself. And in the memo, he writes, "Goodbye, Brian. I'll never ask you for anything again." What? With all this evidence piling up, Brian is now officially a federal fugitive. On September 23rd, police go to the Laundrie house to arrest Brian, only to realize that he's already gone. Now everyone is searching for him. The media, social media, Dog the Bounty Hunter, and still he is nowhere to be found. There was a gray Mustang left at Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park for days, and the car belonged to the Laundries. Allegedly, Brian told his parents that he was going hiking because of the stress. Everything was just getting to him, or he was going camping. And let me just ask, the stress of what exactly? The stress of people protesting outside of your home? The stress of knowing people are looking for Gabby? How about the stress of, I don't know, murdering her? No, not that? Oh, okay. Just wondering. The news reported that the police didn't see Brian leaving because they might have mistaken him for his mom. And then we see a text message from Roberta Laundrie herself saying, quote, "The Northport police said Brian and I have a similar build. Boy, Brian would not be happy about that." Wow, Roberta, you are just so funny. Haha, laugh, laugh. Your son killed somebody. But Cassie responds saying, "Yeah, everyone's laughing at that remark because not even remotely close." I thought we weren't speaking, Cassie, because this sure looks like a friendly conversation to me. And then they go back and forth, cracking jokes about Roberta's body shape, making fun of the police surveillance team. And Cassie sarcastically says, quote, "Must have been the hat. Put their top-notch guys on surveillance. Your brother killed somebody." Meanwhile, there's an actual search for Brian while the Laundries are joking around, making fun of the police. Everyone else is searching. Law enforcement, volunteers, dogs, drones, helicopters. They're searching the Carlton Reserve, but the conditions are a nightmare. It's raining, it's flooding, their dogs are getting attacked by alligators. They're wading through waist-deep waters. It's a swampy mess. And after weeks of searching, they find nothing. Brian had been missing for 37 days, and suddenly the Laundries decide to go to the park to help locate him. They get there right at 7 a.m. as soon as the park opens. And in just about an hour, Brian's dad casually finds a waterproof bag that belonged to Brian. And then just 45 minutes later, Brian's remains are discovered. And you mean to tell me that after 5 weeks of law enforcement, search dogs, drones, helicopters, and teams wading through waist-deep swamp water, a man in cargo shorts and a woman with a $3 backpack found Brian in an hour and 45 minutes? And he was found less than a mile from where he parked his car. Now let's talk about how Brian was found. His clothes, his shoes, his backpack, and belongings were all still in the area. His cause of death was a self-inflicted wound to the head. And by the time they found him, he was decomposed all the way down to the bone. A lot of people online started questioning about how that's even possible. So let's actually compare Brian and Gabby's environments to break it down. Brian Laundrie's remains were discovered on October 20th in 2021 in Florida's Carlton Reserve, a hot, humid, swampy environment. In forensic terms, skeletal remains means that all the soft tissues, skin, muscle, and organs have decayed, been eaten by scavengers, or broken down due to environmental factors, leaving only bones or fragments behind. And how fast a body skeletonizes depends on the environment. Florida's wetlands are a perfect storm for rapid decomposition. High humidity speeds up bacterial growth. Flooding and water exposure accelerate tissue breakdown. Scavengers, alligators, wild boars, insects, birds can strip a body very quickly. Weeks of rain and standing water create the ideal condition for rapid decay. And given these factors, Brian being completely skeletonized in 5 weeks is not impossible. Now compare that to Gabby. Gabby was found in Wyoming about 3 to 4 weeks after her death. Colder temperatures can actually preserve soft tissues for months. So while Brian's body broke down rapidly in Florida's extreme conditions, Gabby's remained more intact due to the cold. And I don't think people give Florida's climate enough credit when discussing decomposition, because everybody says that it can't happen that fast and he's off living in Argentina somewhere. Inside the waterproof bag, investigators found photos of Brian and Gabby along with a notebook. And in this notebook, Brian left letters to his family, essentially saying goodbye. But let's break down what was released from this notebook. Gabby, I wish I was at your side. I wish I could be talking to you right now. I'd be going through every memory we made, getting even more excited for the future. But we lost our future. I can't live without you. No. You lost the future. No. Even that's a mistake. You took the future. Let's go on. I've lost every day we could have spent together, every holiday. I'll never get to play with again. Never go hiking with TJ. I loved you more than anything. I can't bear to look at our photos to recall great times. It is why I cannot go on. When I close my eyes, I will think of laughing on the roof of the van. And all of this reads to me, I've lost every holiday. Every day that we could have spent together, I lost. I'll never be able to play with whoever again. I'll never go hiking with TJ. If you were reading Gabs' journal, looking at photos from our life together, flipping through old cards, you wouldn't want to live a day without her, knowing that every day you'll wake up without her. You wouldn't want to wake up. I'm sorry to anyone this will affect. Gabby was the love of my life, but I know, adored by many. I'm so very sorry to her family because I love them. I'd consider her younger siblings my best of friends. I'm sorry to my family. This is a shock to them as well as a terrible grief. If you had any sort of love for her family, you would have responded to their phone calls. They loved as much, if not more than me, a new daughter to my mother, an aunt to my nephews. Please do not make this harder for them. This occurred as an unexpected tragedy. Rushing back to our car, trying to cross the streams, before it got too dark to see, too cold. I hear a splash and a scream. I could barely see. I couldn't find her for a moment, shouted her name. I found her breathing, heavily gasping. She was freezing cold. The temperature had dropped to freezing and she was soaking wet. I carried her as far as I could from the stream toward the car, stumbling, exhausted in shock, and knew I couldn't safely carry her. I started a fire and spooned her as close to the heat. She was so thin, had already been freezing too long. I couldn't at the time realize that I should have started the fire first, but I wanted her out of the cold back to the car. When I pulled Gabby out of the water, she couldn't tell me what hurt. She had a small bump on her forehead that eventually got larger. Her feet hurt. Her wrist hurt. But she was freezing, shaking violently. While carrying her, she continually made sounds of pain. Laying next to her, she said little between violent shakes, gasping in pain, begging for an end to her pain. She would fall asleep and I would shake her awake, fearing she shouldn't close her eyes if she had a concussion. She would wake in pain, start the whole painful cycle again, furious that I was the one waking her. She wouldn't let me try to cross the creek. Thought like me that the fire would go out in her sleep and she'd freeze. I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries, only that she was in extreme pain. I ended her life. I thought it was merciful, that it was what she wanted, but I see now all the mistakes I made. I panicked. I was in shock, but from the moment I decided, took away her pain, I knew I couldn't go on without her. That's right. You loved her so much. She is the love of your life. You cannot live without her. You also apparently couldn't have called 911. That never crossed your mind? That she is in so much pain that maybe you should call someone? I have 2 children and a husband, and my children have been in positions of pain where they are crying and screaming. And I am also crying because I would just want to take away their pain. My first inclination is never in their pain. I don't know, I should strangle them to death. I don't believe a word of this letter. I think it is all very self-serving. I think if you look at Brian's art, if you look at the way he writes, I think that this is very dark, dramatic, moody, just a way he would want to go out. You knew at the moment that you ended her life, you could not go on without her, right? Yet you didn't end your life. No, actually, let's continue to see what you did after you took Gabby Petito's life from her. I rushed home to spend any time I had left with my family. I wanted to drive north and let James or TJ kill me, but I wouldn't want them to spend time in jail over my mistake. I am ending my life not because of a fear of punishment, but rather because I can't stand to live another day without her. I've lost our whole future, together, every moment we could have shared. I'm sorry for everyone's loss. Please do not make life harder for my family. They lost a son and a daughter. The most wonderful girl in the world. Gabby, I'm sorry. If Roberta or your dad cared about Gabby like a daughter, they would have called somebody. And you cared about her so much, and she was your everything, that you left her in Grand Teton National Park. You didn't have the balls to call and tell her parents where she was. You're so sorry, and you love all these people. And at no point could you have done any of the right things. You drove home in her van. You used her credit card. You created alibis. You Venmo'd yourself $700 from her account. You loved her so much that you didn't want to cooperate with police at all to help them at least find her. And then when you write some bullshit letter about how this isn't about getting out of punishment, but this is because I can't live without her. From the time that she allegedly got hurt until the time that you ended your own life, there was not one action that you took that shows any one of us that you actually cared about Gabby Petito. Not one. And since we're in the business of writing letters, let's take a little excerpt from Roberta Laundrie and the letter that she wrote to you. Remember that love is a verb, not a noun. It's not a thing. It's not words. It's actions. Watch people's actions to know if they love you. And I hate to say it, but Roberta got this one thing right. In the documentary, Gabby's stepfather makes it very clear from Gabby's autopsy, not one of the versions Brian wrote in his notebook was accurate. And he goes on to restate the truth. The sole cause of Gabby's death was strangulation. On August 29th, a series of phone calls takes place between Brian and his parents. And in these calls, they become aware, or everybody thinks they become aware, that Gabby is gone. Their immediate response, they wire money to a lawyer, not to search for Gabby, not to help find answers, not to call her parents. Gabby's mom, Nicole Schmidt, points out something very odd about Brian's letter. In it, he wrote, "Leave my parents out of this. It has nothing to do with them." But the aftermath had everything to do with them. Do you have the right to get a lawyer? Absolutely. Do you have the right to refuse to talk to police or the Petitos? Absolutely. But how do you know what you know, do what you did, and still sleep at night? Because I have questions. And based on the morality or lack thereof shown by Roberta and her husband, I have a pretty clear picture of where Brian got it from. Because remember, they lied. They told police that they didn't know why Gabby's parents were calling them, all while already knowing, allegedly, she was deceased, because they had already retained a lawyer. Now, legally, the Laundries were never charged, but there are strong arguments that they should have been. Whether they could be charged depends on what they knew and when they knew it, and whether they actively obstructed justice. In my opinion, yes, absolutely. But legally, here's where things get complicated. If the prosecutors could prove that the Laundries actively misled investigators or helped Brian evade police, they could have been charged. But since they remained silent and lawyered up immediately, there was no clear evidence of obstruction. Some argued the Laundries should be held accountable for failing to report Gabby's death. But, and this one blew my mind, there are no Florida laws requiring someone to report a crime unless they are directly involved. What? Because someone like Brian's just going to walk to the police department and be like, "Hey guys, sorry, I committed a crime." If you have knowledge of a crime, you should have to call somebody. If they knowingly gave false statements about Brian's whereabouts, they could have been charged. But since they never officially spoke to police, they avoided perjury or false reporting charges. Although they did tell police they didn't know where Gabby was or what happened to her. And now this documentary is saying that they did. So technically, isn't that misleading law enforcement? One of the best points made in this documentary is from Joe Petito. You're going to throw out $25,000 to get an attorney for Brian, and you're just never going to ask why? Not one single question. Ultimately, the Laundries likely weren't charged because they exercised their right to remain silent. There was no clear evidence of them helping Brian commit a crime or evade police. And at the time of his disappearance, Brian was not officially a fugitive. So instead of criminal charges, Gabby's parents filed a civil lawsuit against them, accusing them of intentional infliction of emotional distress for withholding information while they desperately searched for Gabby. This lawsuit wouldn't send the Laundries to jail, but it was meant to hold them accountable in court. In May of 2022, Gabby's mom filed a wrongful death suit against Brian Laundrie's estate, stating that he was responsible for Gabby's murder. By November of 2022, a Sarasota County court awarded $3 million to Gabby's estate, but because Brian didn't have much in assets, the ruling was mostly symbolic. The Petitos sued the Laundries and their attorney, Stephen Bertolino, for causing emotional distress by keeping information about Gabby's death from them. And guess what? The case was settled privately on February 21st, 2024, avoiding a trial. Look at that. Once again, the Laundries find a way to say nothing. Unbelievable. In October of 2022, 1 year after Gabby's death, her family, Rose Davis, and her ex-boyfriend, Jackson, went to Teton, Wyoming, to the exact place where Gabby was found. They released her ashes. And to me, it felt like in that moment they were setting, I'm getting goosebumps right now talking about it. I felt like they were setting her free. And it was really beautiful to watch. During the exit interviews, they spoke about how many lives have been saved because of Gabby's story. Rose Davis mentioned how they received countless messages from people saying that they were leaving their abusive relationships because Gabby's story opened their eyes to the toxicity that they were living in. The Gabby Petito Foundation was created by Gabby's family to honor her memory and help others affected by domestic violence and missing person cases. The foundation's mission is to raise awareness about domestic violence, provide resources to victims and families, support organizations assisting missing persons and abuse survivors, advocate for stronger laws to protect victims, fundraise, educate, and push for real change. More information can be found at gabbypetitofoundation.org, which I will also link in the description down below. One critical issue this case highlighted was missing white woman syndrome, because Gabby's case opened a larger conversation about how many people, especially people of color, go missing without ever receiving near the same attention or resources that Gabby did. And Joe Petito, Gabby's dad, admitted that when he first heard about this, his reaction was not positive. But here is what I really respect about Joe. Instead of getting defensive, he said, you know what? I'm going to educate myself. And that's exactly what he did. And that's something a lot of people could learn from. There's a media clip in the documentary that puts it perfectly. This isn't about saying Gabby isn't important, because she is, but so are other missing people. The conversation is about how white women are overrepresented in the media, while people of color are underrepresented. And that's a conversation that needs to be had. One of the most extraordinary things about this documentary is seeing the work that Gabby's parents have done since her death. I don't know how they have been able to compose themselves in such a way, to grieve, to push forward, and to make real change, but also to make sure that their daughter did not die in vain. And it's incredible. Since Gabby's tragic death, several legislative measures have been introduced to strengthen protections for domestic violence victims. The Gabby Petito Act was passed in Florida. This law requires police to use lethality assessment protocol, or LAP, when responding to domestic violence calls. Officers must ask standardized questions to determine how much danger the victim is in. This ensures high-risk cases get immediate attention and victims receive support. Utah also passed similar laws after Gabby's case. Officers must complete a lethality assessment form during domestic violence investigations. This helps law enforcement evaluate danger levels and take proper protective actions. These laws won't undo what happened to Gabby, but they could save someone else's life. Unsurprisingly, the Laundries refused to participate in the documentary. But they did have time to tell the New York Post that this documentary is one-sided and filled with inaccuracies. Despite making this claim, they denied to participate or provide their side of the story. Of course they did. Also, there's another rumor I've seen circulating online about Brian's remains being identified by his uncle, who is a dentist, but I found an article that dispels that completely. Brian's remains were identified through official dental records. While some rumors suggested that his uncle, a dentist, was involved in the identification, Gabby Petito's parents have clarified that the process was conducted by a professional medical examiner, not a family member. I think, unfortunately and fortunately, a lot of important conversations have come from this case. It's raised awareness about missing person cases, especially for people who don't look like Gabby and don't receive the same media attention. It showed the world that domestic abuse can happen to anyone, regardless of age, background, or how someone presents themselves. It helped us recognize red flags and understand how controlling relationships work. And while searching for both Brian and Gabby, other missing person cases were solved, meaning that other families were able to get closure. And as always, we end this video with the most important part, and that was, who was Gabby Petito? Gabby Petito was more than just a headline. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman full of dreams and adventure. She loved deeply, embraced life fully, and left an impact on everyone who knew her. Though her story ended far too soon, her legacy continues to shine. Through the voices advocating for change, the awareness her case has brought to domestic violence, and the countless lives touched by her memory. Gabby's story is a reminder to look out for one another, to recognize the warning signs of abuse, to always fight for those who can no longer speak for themselves. If you found this video informative, eye-opening, or important, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out some of our other videos. My name is Bacon Bears. That's my opinion, and I'll see you next week.